bem-vindos em mais uma aula da pós-graduação em Paisagismo Ecológico da PUC-Rio. Hoje é um dia um pouco diferente, estamos em trânsito, eu e a Cecília, então, como vocês podem ver, a gente não morre de tédio, não. Então, a pós-graduação em Paisagismo Ecológico da PUC-Rio, ela é constituída de 6 departamentos da universidade. A gente está muito feliz de receber hoje o Mark Barra. Esse webinar está sendo gravado nesse momento. Ele vai ser retransmitido no YouTube, né? Há uma chance muito pequena da câmera pegar alguém, é quase impossível, mas isso nunca ocorreu, então podem ficar tranquilos, a gente prefere que vocês fiquem com a câmera ligada, né? Hoje, a gente conta com a tradução simultânea português e inglês, que é realizada por intérpretes formandos do curso de formação de intérpretes da Conferência da PUC-Rio. A gente agradece demais a equipe, a sua disposição, seu auxílio, que vai contribuir à boa realização do evento, né? Para que a tradução corra bem, pedimos que façam suas falas e perguntas pausadamente, mas isso aqui, as perguntas vão se fazer mais pelo chat mesmo, tá? Para ouvir a tradução, basta clicar no ícone do globo que aparece na parte inferior à direita do Zoom e selecionar a língua português, assim como a opção Mute original, ou desativar o som original, para voltar a ouvir os palestrantes na língua original, né? Clique novamente no globo e selecione a opção Off. Então, acho que eu falei tudo. Estou aqui um pouco estranho, um pouco dentro do carro, chegando em casa, né? Pedimos desculpa a Cecília pelos acontecimentos de última hora, mas em nada vai atrapalhar a aula do Mark, que está já preparado, já testamos tudo, e em breve vamos estar, eu e a Cecília, preparados para dar continuidade à palestra do Mark. Cecília, quer falar alguma coisa?
Quero, sim.
Não estamos te ouvindo.
Alô, tá ouvindo?
Agora sim.
Alô, gente, boa noite. Estou super feliz de estar com todo mundo aí. Hoje eu tive um imprevisto, porque eu estou num evento pela primeira vez presencial e atrasou a minha mesa. Então, eu estou aqui que nem o Pierre também está em trânsito, mas eu vou chegar e em tempo da gente poder fazer a discussão, e eu vou ouvindo a apresentação do Marco. E aí eu vou dar as boas-vindas para o Marco agora. Mark, thanks so much for being here with us. I would like very much for you to introduce yourself, because I think you're the best person to talk about what you do and actually about your job, the things you like. And I think that's it. You are very welcome. Thank you very much for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Cecilia. So yeah, I didn't hear you very well, but you asked me to introduce to myself. So yeah, thank you very much, Cecilia, and I hope you can hear me well. And thanks for inviting me, Cecilia, Pierre-André. I'm very happy to be able to share with you some example of what we do here in France and in the Paris region. So I'm an urban ecologist, and I've been working for 12 years now in what we call the Agency for Biodiversity in the Paris region, in the Paris area, which is attached to an urbanism institute and urban planning institute. So I work on a daily basis with architects, with urban planners, trying to integrate some biodiversity principles and trying to foster nature-based solution into the urban planning process. Should I start to share my screen?
I believe, yes. Mark, I believe that you can now start your presentation, and I'm going to invite everybody also to present itself in the chat, your name, your formation, your activity, and whatever you think it's important for us. And Mark, maybe you can talk a little bit slower, I believe, for the translation. And good presentation, and nice to have us as you with us. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you. I will share my screen. Can you see? I put it in full screen. Normally, it should work now in a full screen. Can you see it? Should be working. Okay. So yeah,
it
thank
is
you.
working. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I will try to speak slowly, and sorry in advance if my English is not always proper, and if I speak too fast. So I will try to do it correctly. So yeah, I wanted to share with you some examples of nature-based solution that we've been doing in the Paris region, but also try to highlight some urban ecology principles that we are working on, and that might be relevant for landscape design and landscape planning and urban projects, because I know you're working on this field, and maybe after that discuss together about the challenges that we face in the planning process. So maybe as an introduction, I would say that, like in other big metropolis, the main challenge that we are facing is artificialization, and actually that's a big deal at the moment in France. And to show you some figures, between 33,000 and 30,000 hectares are being consumed every year by artificialization in France. So mostly in the coastal areas nearby the sea, but actually everywhere. And one of the indicator that is quite interesting on the right here is that the rate of land take is actually faster than the population growth. And I think that's a trend of a lot of metropolis at the moment. And in France, we were surprised to learn that 40% of this land take occurs in cities where housing vacancies are increasing. So the trend at the moment is that we have a very inefficient use of the soil, and that we have to take reform to halt this urbanization process. And that's what is happening at the moment. 3 months ago, the French government launched what they call a zero net land take objective. And that was quite a good surprise actually in France. In this objective that was reflected in the law, the land consumption must be reduced by 50% by 2025. And that's a very good news, because we know that if we want to protect nature, the best way to do it is not to restore or create. The priority is to protect the land that is existing. So that was the good news. And one of the aspects of this law is that we will have to favor urban renewal and foster densification also of urban areas. And I wanted to talk about that, of these densification policies, because if land take reduction is good news, densification policies could lead to some of the problem. And I identify 3 problems about densifications that we have to be careful about. The first one is that densification policies could lead to more impacts of the climate change. And that's what we are experiencing at the moment in the Paris region. I think it's quite the same in other big metropolis. Over the last year, we have very severe flood events that occurred in Paris, as you can see in the picture here. It's become more frequent, and it's also reinforced by strong artificialization of the soil in the Paris city, but also in the surroundings. The other big effect of climate change that we are experiencing is the urban heat island. And you have on the right a map of Paris. During the heat waves 10 years ago, there was a huge difference between 7 and 8 degrees of difference between the center of Paris and the suburbs. So actually more densifications mean more impacts on climate change effects. The second point of this densification policies is that it could increase also ecological inequalities that are very strong actually in the Paris region. Here you have a map of the green space cover on the left of the most wealthy city in the Paris area, Neuilly-sur-Seine, and on the right, the poorest city of the Paris region. And you see the huge difference in the green cover, but it's also a huge difference in annual revenues of the population. If we densify the city, we can also threaten those green spaces. Currently in the Paris region, more than 900 municipalities, communities are considered as green space deprived. And 75 as very deprived. That means below 3 square meters of green spaces per inhabitant in some parts of the region. So that's also another problem. And the last one, of course, and that's the thing I'm working on, it's biodiversity. Densification policies could lead to more loss of intra-urban habitats. And that's what we notice at the moment. On the left here, I show you some indicators of biodiversity in the Paris region. And we know that in dense area, biodiversity is declining. And actually the abundance of butterflies, but also birds and bats has fallen by more than 20% in urban spaces compared to 20 years ago. So that's also a huge problem. There's also another effect, which is what we call in ecology biotic homogenization, which means that we notice that some specialist species are gradually being replaced by more generalist species. For example, on birds, all the birds that are depending on buildings, such as house sparrow, for example, they are replaced by other species like pigeons and more generalist species. That's what we observe. And on the left part of the presentation, you have a map of the wasteland that have been assessed in the Paris region, and that's the place that urban dwellers want for densification. And that could be also a problem for biodiversity, because the studies show that wasteland host a lot of biodiversity. Actually, if they have a dense vegetation cover, we show that the plant diversity in wasteland is higher than in other green spaces that are managed in the city. And they attract also species that usually avoid the urban areas, such as foxes, for example, such as bird of prey. And that's the third problem of densification. So that's why, for all these reasons, actually, we have to fight against urban sprawl, but we also have to have a strategy on nature-based solution, which will be a win-win strategy to reduce land deprivation that we observe, to adapt to climate change that is more frequent in our region, and also to recover the biodiversity that is still declining. And we have the chance that a lot of municipalities are taking actions on biodiversity, and especially through these mechanisms that you see here on the right, which is called the French Capital of Biodiversity Award. And most of the examples that I will show you are taken from this competition that was launched 10 years ago in France. So more nature-based solution, but we could also raise the question, how should we design and manage nature-based solution? And it's very interesting to look at what scientists said, and they say that nature-based solutions are not only green spaces, they're also ecosystem that should provide measurable benefits to biodiversity. Well, the publication you can see here is a very great work from a lot of urban ecology scientists, which is called Making Nature City. And they have compiled some of the principles that need to be addressed by landscape practitioners and policymakers to address biodiversity and nature-based solution. And there are different elements that are important in the planning process, such as the size of habitats for nature, also the connections between patches of habitats for nature, the quality of this matrix, of this natural matrix in the city, the diversity, of course, of the different elements of biodiversity, the native plants, etc., etc. And I would like to go through those principles and how we can address them while designing for nature-based solution in the city. The first of them is the space that we need. Most of the publication in urban ecology showed that biodiversity needs space, and it need more space than what we have at the moment in our city. And this research here is very interesting. It was made by Benind and his colleague in a few years ago, and they showed that in 75 cities that they have monitored, they show that if we need biodiversity, we have to keep a minimum area of 4.4 hectares minimum to ensure a stability for urban species, classic urban species. But they also show that if we want to attract species that usually avoid the urban areas, such as mammals, for example, big mammals, such as bird of prey, the green cover must be extended to 53 hectares. So that's only figures, but that can give us an example of the extent of green space we need to reach when designing a city. And that's quite interesting. There was another work done in the UK by researchers that found an intermediate size of habitats for biodiversity, and they're talking about 10 hectares, which would be a surface that maximize both the storage of carbon and attract also the pollinators. So here we have a kind of framework of the ideal, I would say, size of green spaces in the city to attract more biodiversity that could be useful when we're designing a city framework. And two of the projects of a recent project in the Paris region were interesting because they were done for protecting a big patch of habitats. The first one on the left is what we call the Bois Saint-Martin, nearby Paris, and it's more than 280 hectares of land that was bought by the local government in order to protect it and to remain a natural place. And on the right, it's a natural reserve, but actually very nearby urban areas, that was also protected and protected from a golf project that was about to happen in the city. So it's quite new, this kind of project. Before, we used to build on these places, and now, because there is more political will, those places are bought by the local government and are protected in the urban process. So that's a kind of a successful example. There's another example here. It's in the north of Paris city, and I think it's one of the best example of nature-based solution that we have in the Paris region. Cecilia visited it a few years ago for a conference here in Paris, and this place is exactly the definition of a nature-based solution, because it was designed to manage rainwater and flood around the city. Actually, it's a new wetland that has been created on 12 hectares, and it has a capacity of 55,000 cubic meters of water storage. And before that was created, the city all around used to be flooded every year because of strong artificialization of soil. They could have used water tanks and concrete tanks, but they decided to restore a wetland. So it was designed to manage the flood, but it's also explicitly designed to provide measurable benefits to biodiversity. And there's an ongoing monitoring at the moment that we do with our colleagues on different group of species, butterflies, birds and mammals and pollinators. And we show a great increase. It's been 3 years that the project exists, and we show a very good increase in biodiversity. And the third point is that it's also a place for the people. And that's on a place where people were lacking green spaces. And now they have an area to observe nature, to run, to walk. And that's exactly the definition of a nature-based solution. Another principle of urban ecology that you all know, I think, of course, is that the size of green space is one thing, but green spaces must be connected each other. And there's a lot of evidence that this landscape connectivity will help biodiversity in cities. One of the difficulty that we have in France is to integrate every scale of this landscape connectivity, and to go from the regional scale to the city scale and to the local scale. And at the moment we have a lot of maps actually, but it's very difficult to go at the local scale and to be very precise actually in dense urban areas. But it's moving forward at the moment. And some of the cities that really manage to design this green corridor and this landscape connectivity assessment are the ones that have a strong knowledge of biodiversity before they build their strategy. And here, this is an example of a city outside of the Paris region that established what we call a communal atlas of biodiversity. And it's during 3 years, they do a lot of inventories of species, they gather a lot of data, and they create this kind of atlas map that bring all the knowledge on biodiversity and that help them to design the green and blue corridors schemes for the urban planning. So knowledge is essential. And then some cities are using different kind of tools to integrate this green and blue grid in the city. And two very nice examples in France are the first one on the left is the city of Strasbourg in the east of France. They designed a green network in the city and in the dense city using a software actually that is called GraphHub, and that is used for modeling landscape graphs by targeting specific species. And they use the red squirrel here as a species because the red squirrel is struggle to go into the dense urban areas. So they managed to identify actually the obstacles for the red squirrel. And another two on the right was developed by the city of Rennes in the west part of France. And here they actually did a field experiment where they used the hedgehogs as sensors to identify ecological corridors. They equipped the hedgehogs with sensors, and they released some hedgehogs in urban gardens in the city center. And they followed them by remote sensing, and then they saw where the hedgehog goes in the city and where they were blocked by an obstacle. And that's also another tool to really identify concrete ecological network in the city. And there's actually a growing number of actions around the ecological corridor and a growing number of wildlife crossing in France. I just show you a different kind of wildlife crossing that we took in photo here in the Paris region and outside the Paris region. Some stuff you might know already, but these ones are actually really working, and some are made for mammals here on the top and the big picture here. Some other also we see a lot of cities that have corridors for squirrels, which are just quite basically a rope in between two trees or above a road, for example. And also a lot of wildlife crossing for amphibians, for frogs, for example, that are below roads here, and those are actually working very well and help the species to go from one place to another. About the big bridges like this one, there was a lot of bridges like this that weren't working actually because they were not wide enough. So I think there's a specific width that we need above 20 meters wide actually to attract the species, and also use some dead wood, for example, to attract more insect species or to make food for other kind of species. And another example of restoring a corridor in urban area, and the blue corridor in particular, it's this this project in the north of Paris. What you see in the picture is a river reopening project that happened in the city of Sarcelles. We're actually in a very dense area in next to Paris, and in the city 30 years ago, the city center was completely submerged by water during a flood, and they experienced a lot of flood events. So the municipality decided to reopen one river that was buried, channeled, and completely recovered by concrete. And you have the picture here before. And then 8 years after, maybe, because that's a kind of project that takes some time, they reopened the river here on 40 meters. And that was a great success because here also it was made to manage rainwater and stormwater, but they quickly noticed that it was also a very big job for biodiversity, as in this deprived space, a lot of species came back, a lot of frogs, a lot of insects, pollinators. So that's also a great example of nature-based solution. It was not easy for the people. The project leader of this operation says that the first year of the reopening, a lot of people used to throw garbage on the river. They weren't happy of the new landscape because they were not, this project was not done with co-construction at the beginning. So now they did a lot of educational and training project with the people for them to accept this kind of project, and now it's really working. It's a new environment for the people that enjoy it every day. And staying in corridors, we have more and more this challenge of light pollution in France, but as in any other big cities. And a lot of cities now are trying to reduce this light pollution and create what we call now a darkness corridor. So it's because we know that a lot of species are fleeing light. A lot of species of bats and birds, they don't like to stay in places where it's lit at night. And here it's an experiment in the city of Lille in the north of France, where they reduce the light nearby the river, but also, as you can see on the picture in down, they change the wavelength of the lights, and they switched between blue lights or white lights and yellow light. And actually that made a huge change for the species, because species of bats, they prefer orange bulbs and orange lights like this one, and they show a real effect on the species. So now a lot of cities are just either turning off the light in some suburbs, or either changing the wavelength of the light, and it has a very positive effect on the species. But now all the challenge is to convince the people that it's not less safe, for example, but there's a lot of question about that today ongoing in France. There's also some project, we were talking about the urban heat island that we have to face in many places in France. And there are some projects now to use nature to reduce urban heat island. So I think you already saw this kind of pictures, but they're really impressive. I think it's this capacity of vegetation and of nature to reduce the temperature in cities at every scale. And here in the picture, you see that the difference between the built part of the city and the part covered with vegetation are really different in temperature. Sometimes it's 10, 20, 30 degrees decrease in surface temperature. So we have scientific proof now that more nature in the city is a way to reduce the temperature. But these thermal images that we see here are an indicator of temperature, but they are not an indicator of cooling, actually, because we know that to cool the streets and to cool the urban environment, the streets and the vegetation need water. And if they have water, they're able to transpirate, and we say evapotranspirate, and that's what creates the cooling effect. So depending on the part of the world we are, the problem that we have, for example, in the Paris city, is that when we need water in summer days, we don't have it anymore because there's drought and water is scarce actually when we need it the most. So this is interesting to see how some cities manage to collect water during the year and use it when they need the most for cooling the street, for example. And here in the picture is one of the best examples that we have in France. It's come from Lyon, a big city in the center of France. And actually, they a few years ago, they started to restore vegetation on some streets, as this one. It used to be a street very mineral with a lot of cars. So they decided to plant a lot of trees, but not only trees, they also planted shrubs and a lot of herbs and different kind of vegetation. And what they did is that they put sensor on the trees to measure the temperature and try to monitor the cooling effect of the trees. And about the water, they actually all year round, they collect the water from the street and from the buildings around. They have water tanks beneath the streets. So the water is stored all year round, and when the hot summer days come, they pump the water out and they irrigate the trees so they can evapotranspirate and cool the city. And what they have shown after 3 years of study is that in hot summer days, the temperature has decreased, can decrease by 3 degrees, which is quite strong actually in very hot summer days. So it's working, and here it's a good example of a mix between nature-based solution, but also classic solution to store water underneath the street, for example. And if we want a real cooling effect, we need to have this water around and to store it somewhere to be able to irrigate the plants. So nature-based solution to fight against climate change and biodiversity, but there's also a question that we are raising at the moment with landscape designers and landscape architects in the place where I'm working. This question is: are any green space actually a nature-based solution? Is it because it's green that we can call it a nature-based solution? And of course not. There are some principles to take into account. Well, according to my biodiversity point of view, we're still a little bit far away from what we call nature-based solution. And in France, we have this very heritage of the landscape school from the Versailles Castle and Le Nôtre, which was a great landscape designer. And we're still doing green space like this one with a lot of order, with a lot of geometry, with a lot of colors, and sometimes less biodiversity. And that's why now I think that there's a lot of landscape architects are interested in biodiversity science now and are changing their practices to integrate more urban ecology principle. And that's very interesting to see this movement of landscape architects. And yes, sometimes actually NBS are often confused with this traditional landscape, and we think, yeah, it will support biodiversity because it's green. And this phenomenon has been called by some researcher the blandscaping phenomenon, which is by opposition to landscaping. The blandscaping is that landscaping that use the same design, the same patterns, and the same species also everywhere in different regions and nationally and globally. And I think nature-based solutions are a way to avoid this blandscaping that we see on green spaces, but that we see also on green roof. I've been working on green roof, and we see a lot this blandscaping of the same pattern of green roof everywhere. And so I'm convinced that nature-based solution is the search for a diversity of solution that is very different from one place to another. And that's what we read actually on scientific publications. More resilient green spaces and more biodiverse green spaces are the one with a diversity of habitats, are the one with a diversity of structure of vegetation, and also are the ones adapted to the local context, for example, with native plants. And here it's an example of a green space that was designed by landscape designers and ecologists as well. And they have left a lot of dead wood on the green space and also litter on the ground. And they have also varied the vegetation strata. Those actions are confirmed by researchers that some of them have shown that if you increase the volume of the different strata on a green space, that will increase mechanically the occupancy for bats, for birds, and for some insects as well. So more different structures of vegetation will lead to more biodiversity. And also some researchers have shown that if you increase the proportion of native plants on the green space, that will increase also native pollinators that feed on plants, and also native birds that feed on pollinators. So that will have an effect on all the chain, the food chain of the biodiversity. And we had the chance a few years ago to have this initiative in France, which is called végétal local, meaning local vegetation. And actually, this is a process that allows cities to buy directly from the suppliers native plants and native seeds adapted to the climate. So here you have a map of France, and then they divided France into different climate regions. And actually, those suppliers from those regions are able to provide native plants for the green space manager. So that was a great improvement for green space design, actually, and for using native plants that we didn't find on the market. Some people used to go on the wild and collect seeds, but this accelerated the process. More native plants and also more native habitats also. And we've seen a lot in France. We've seen a lot of these insect hostels that you might know also, and they're present in a lot of metropolis, which are very useful for education and training of the people, but which might be not very useful for insects. And actually, that's what some specialists of insects have shown. The insect needs certain design, and for example, in this kind of insect hotel, they only use the tubes, the small tubes, but not the rest of the stuff. And here again, when we talk about taking into account biodiversity and nature-based solution, the best habitat for insects are actually the one that they use on nature. And on the right here, you see that if you want to attract white bees and white pollinators in cities, it's better to restore some meadows, for example, which are the most attractive for insects. But also a lot of insects are living on the soil and on the ground. So for these ground nesting insects, the best habitat is keeping some sandy areas or even some brownfields on the city. So I think the landscape design could also go towards this biodiversity-based approach and species-based approach, which could help to diversify the type of habitats for biodiversity in the city. And here are some examples that's quite new for us in France, and the green space used to be very, very green and very mowed every year. And now they have improved the management, and we see this kind of stuff here. You have two examples of green space with dead wood and old wood that were protected and put here on purpose as habitats for other species and for insects. So sometimes it's just left like this, and sometimes it's like a piece of art also for education of the people. But that's very useful, of course, for insects. And a lot of people are still questioning this kind of practices, saying it might be a problem for security or for my children. So there is still a long way for this kind of practices. And yes, that this new landscaping process is what some researchers call the species-led landscaping. And a researcher called Communal has worked on that in the UK, and they show here an example of actually in green space that was made for a specific species. The beetle bump habitat was created for a species that we call the strict bombardier bee, beetle, sorry. They create actually the habitat using a specific blend of recycled aggregate. They also used some sandy material. They collected the plants in an area nearby to bring it to this site. Actually, everything that they done on the design was made to target this species. And that could be interesting to do that in some cities, to target one species or a group of species instead of targeting just some kind of plants, for example, or targeting a color, or targeting a specific design, for example. And here they did surveys, and they saw that after some years, they managed to conserve the habitat for the beetle, but that also a lot of species came by, and they actually create a very attractive habitat for a lot of species and for biodiversity. And sometimes regarding landscape practices, we don't need to do anything, actually. And that's something I really like. It's this idea that nature in the city and that nature-based solutions are sometimes solutions done by nature itself, and that we don't have to do anything. Here in the picture, this is a park that you might know, maybe. It's in Berlin, in Germany, the Südgelände Park. And it was a former railway, actually a brownfield and a railway, where the nature came back spontaneously. And there's a lot of places like this in Germany with the researcher Ingo Kovarik, who's working on this wide urban woodland, when nature come back without human management and without a lot of design. And I love this idea, and I think we have to find a place for free evolution of nature in cities as well, even if it's more, it's harder to accept. And actually in France, we still struggle to accept this kind of spontaneous nature, which means abandon sometimes. The feeling of abandon for the people. But in some project, we managed to keep this kind of areas, and actually that's what we call the wasteland. And some wastelands in France and in some other places have become like this park here, and actually very attractive for other species. In this place, we find higher levels of urban avoider species than in other places in the city. And we have a small example of this kind of area here in France. Well, it's very small. It's 1.5 hectare, but it's nice because it's in the north of Paris, and it's in a very dense area where people don't have a lot of green spaces. And actually that used to be a wasteland where the municipality wanted to build a school and a new building that was legitimate to build a school, I mean, but the population decided that they wanted to have a green space, and the elected representatives said, okay, we need to create a green space because we lack actually green space. And they actually kept this green space as a brownfield. And the photo you see here is you can see the free evolution of vegetation, and it's very different from ordinary green spaces that we found in this kind of area in France. And people love it. And it's becoming a place for a lot of educational activities for nature, a lot of citizen science protocols that are done by the people, and a lot of children also learning about nature and free evolution of nature. And we start to move forward to this reduction of green space management. So just to show you a picture of a city that have strongly reduced the management, they have reduced mowing by 70% for 10 years here, meaning that they mow just one time a year, and they also mow beyond 7 centimeters in order to protect the insects and the larvae in the green space. So that's also a big change in front. We used to mow every well, 4 times a year, and now just once a year. It's a big change, and that makes nice landscapes as well. So in the Paris region, we have this label which is called Eco Jardin, which certifies the green space design and management regarding biodiversity and also water management, but also using native species. And this kind of labeling process also helped the cities to move forward and to communicate on good practices. And another way to manage the green space using biodiversity and sustainable practices is this one. It's a city in the east of France, in Laxou, and actually here they use goats to manage and try to control invasive species. I don't know if you know this invasive species. It's called the Japanese knotweed, and it's very invasive, and we found it on the riverbanks of a lot of rivers, also on wetlands, and it's very difficult to get rid of it. And we saw a lot of projects where cities spend a lot of money, spend a lot of material trying to burn, to destroy this kind of plants, and actually that's not successful. And there's a lot of environmental impacts, collateral impacts actually on invasive species management. But they found here that the best mowing and management was the goats. And actually they saw that in 2 years, if there is a regular grazing on these areas, then the Japanese knotweed is not disappearing, but it's controlled, and sufficiently controlled so that other species can grow, and then the ecosystem finds another equilibrium, if I would say. So I'm very interested in those biological management of invasive species, which finally works better than classic management. And grazing is quite fashionable now on green space. That's another way to replace the mowing machine. And here you have some pictures around Paris of urban grazing as an alternative management to green spaces. So here some sheep around Paris and some cows, and also some new jobs actually that are invented regarding these ecological management practices. This guy is a shepherd of the city of Cergy-Pontoise in the north of Paris, and he's employed, by the city. And he's actually going from one green space to another everywhere in the city with the sheep and the goats here, and manage all the green space. So that's instead for the city, instead of paying for mowing machines, they pay someone and give money to people to create this job, which is more ecological. So that's very successful, and people love it. Like you see here in the photo. And I think that could be the future of green space management. And my time is going, so I think I will pass this one, but maybe quickly. There's a growing interest in the Paris region about urban agriculture. I don't know if it's the same in Brazil, but a lot of people are actually seeing nature only by the prism of cultivating stuff and cultivating nature. And as an ecologist at the beginning, I was a little bit surprised because for me, nature-based solution and nature policies were not cultivated nature. But actually, that's what people want. And I'm also very interested to see how cultivating and how urban agriculture actually can be a good point of entry for bringing back nature in the city. And to understand the links between biodiversity and urban agriculture, we actually monitored 20 sites of urban agriculture all around Paris. And that's what really interesting. We monitored biodiversity in these different sites, and the first results that we have show that the diversity of plants actually in urban agriculture was higher than in other urban ecosystems that we could compare, such as urban parks and such as green roof also that we monitored in another project. So actually even cultivated biodiversity is also a way to increase the global diversity within the city. And usually in this kind of project, there's always a diversity of microhabitats, such as bare soils for solitary bees, piles of stones, boxes for hedgehogs, etc., etc. And the people are interested to create those very small habitats for species. So we're encouraging now urban agriculture everywhere it's possible, as where we're encouraging also spontaneous nature in other parts of the city. I think it's a mix of different kind of practices that we need to address. And there's also a big rise of this urban plantation program in France. The first one was launched in Paris city. Actually, it was called the license to green your city. And now in a lot of cities all around France, people are have the right to plant on the street, on the sidewalk, and sometimes the city gives the material to reopen the concrete. So there's a lot of projects like this. And here on the right, you see one indicator. Actually, we observed a big increase of the plant richness in those urban areas, what we call the urban interstice, like the sidewalk, like the walls, like the road and the streets. And that could be an effect of these urban plantation programs, as well as a ban on pesticides that occurred in France 3 years ago. Pesticides were banned in public and private gardens of citizens. So it means that if we change our management, actually biodiversity can come back in a very short period of time. And 92% of richness increasing is really rapid and really impressive for considering the dynamics of biodiversity. So a lot of projects like this. And one issue we have to be better at is protecting street trees, actually, and protecting trees before doing a project. And I don't know if it happens like this in Brazil, but here in France, usually when you do a landscape project or you do a building project, first you remove all the green spaces and all the topsoil. You make it clean, as some contractors say here in France, we make it clean, and then we build a new green space. And that's what happened in a lot of places here. And it's always sad. And I think the population does not accept anymore that we cut all trees, which are the ones that host the most biodiversity. Like you see on the left side here, that was in the city of Strasbourg for an extension project of a building. They cut a tree and they discover on the whole of the tree a population of 300 bats that were protected at the European level. And so they had to pay a fine, and they were ashamed actually about that. So now there are more regulation about street trees, and I think that urban planners are understanding that we have to protect them. And the two other photos here are actually two building projects, district projects, where they kept the existing trees. So actually the buildings here have something like 5 years, but the trees have 60 years, and they protect it. And that was the work of landscape architect that used to work with ecologists for protecting the streets and just putting the building around the existing streets. So I would love to see more projects than this one. Street trees are important, but also what's underneath street trees. And I'd like to finish by talking about the soils, the urban soils, because that's something that we often forget. And when we think about nature-based solution, we think about vegetation or species, fauna, flora, but less about the soil. And it's very important to take into account the soil, where a lot of process come from. And urban soils, of course, are often polluted and destroyed. And here you have some examples of the importance of soils on urban design. On the left side here, you can see different kind of tree lines. There are two next to the main road here, and one in the middle of the road. Yeah, and you see that trees have a very different size. But and what is interesting here is that all of them have been planted at the same time, at the same period. But the difference is that in the middle of the picture, the streets have a very short concrete tank to leave. But in the side of the road, they have a full soil, if I would say, and the soil connectivity, so a root connectivity, and then a place to grow. And that's also important to reconfigure, reassemble the design to protect this soil continuity and the soil connectivity. And on the right side, this is an experiment in the city of Geneva in Switzerland. And actually they are trying to transform the tree lines by connecting the soil again. And the difference between the two pictures is that on one way it's 10 cubic meters soil tanks for the trees, and on the other way it's a continuous soil connectivity for the urban trees. And they measure that for the growth of trees and the health of trees, it's far better. So we're moving also by taking into account better the soil. And I would say as a conclusion that I think it's maybe it's one of the most important future challenge of urban ecology is to free the soil and to find we don't have any space left for nature in very dense urban areas, so we have to find it by decovering the pavement and by freeing the soil. And I was amazed by this project of the city of Berlin in Germany, where actually they mapped all the paved areas and the former parking lots or schoolyards or some portion of the sidewalk or public places that were paved but that weren't used anymore, even some buildings. And actually they are starting to do some de-sealing projects by removing the concrete and then planting vegetation or restoring soil. So at the moment they do it mostly for mitigation projects. So that means that if they build somewhere, they will have to compensate by de-building or de-sealing somewhere else. But I think we could go further, and there's a huge potential. So here in 2020, they have identified something like 180 zones that could be potentially desealed, and 31 has been completely desealed and 40 partially. So there's a big potential, and we try to do exactly the same kind of study here in the Paris region. And I've been working with my colleagues on a method to identify the potential for desealing and renaturing urban soil. And we have good results, actually. All the places that you see here in the picture were monitored at a city scale. And here, that's the city of Aulnay-sous-Bois in the northern part of France. And all the polygons here are places that can be depaved. And they are concentrated in areas of the city where they accumulate most of the problems for climate change, for biodiversity, and for health and well-being of the population. And these sites, 18 sites, represent more than 150 hectares of waterproof area. And that's only in one city. So at the Paris region scale, that would be hectares and hectares and hectares of sealed places that we could where we could bring back nature. But it costs a lot of money. So the next step for us will be to find a lot of money to depave and make this project happen. And if we don't find money, we could also do it with the people. And I finish with this slide, which is a very nice project coming from the US first and then Canada, which in the US is called Depave, and in Canada is called Sous les Pavés, where the municipality engaged the citizen in asphalt removing and in pavement removing. And I think that's also a way, there's this big potential, and also a way to involve people in nature and in bringing back nature in the cities, could be this kind of projects. And here in Canada, so that's not a lot of surface at the moment, but almost 2,000 square meters of bitumen were removed, but that involved a lot of inhabitants and citizens. So I'm trying to find some projects in Paris and in the Paris region to involve citizens in concrete removing and on planting to bring back some more nature. Okay, I think my time is over, and I would like to talk with you if you have any questions. So, well, thank you for listening, and it'd be a pleasure to discuss with you.
Wonderful, Mark. It's really such a nice presentation, and you passed through a lot of methodologies, technical solutions, and so many cases all around France. And the slide that touched me the most is the one where you show, and sometimes we do nothing. And I believe this is the best, you know, because we're always looking for making something new, to build something, to create something, and sometimes you just leave, just let the nature, and the nature sometimes take back naturally its place. And I really, it's a strong thing than to do nothing, and we have political actor and agent who are already all the time looking for making something, you know? And sometimes it's better to do nothing at all, and just like insert ourselves in a natural place, and really wonderful. And we have a lot of questions. And Cecilia have a problem with its microphone, so she just sent me a message that she's not succeeding to open the microphone. Maybe you can try to enter with your cell phone and use your cell phone for the voice while I'm talking here, Cecilia. And sometimes it happens that Zoom do not let us. So we have a lot of comment. I don't know if you are seeing the chat. It's in Portuguese, but
yeah, I see the chat. I would love to understand.
But people are sending you a lot of congratulations, and
thank you.
that was a wonderful presentation and a lot of inspiration. You know, I believe that showing like is kind of simple, and sometimes it's hard to do simple things. You know, and I love also the landscaping slides where you're talking like there is like a globalization way of design landscapes. It's always the same kind of paths, the same kind of vegetation. We have a landscape architect here in Brazil, which is called Ricardo Cardim, which already invite here. And he sent view from Google Street View all around the world. And it was always spaces in Greece, in Turkey, in United States, in Europe, in South America, in Asia. We always find the same spaces all around the world. Like 5, 6 spaces.
Yeah, that's true. It's a kind of homogenization of cities, and then homogenization of the nature in the cities. And on houses, we observed that in France, a lot of houses that used to be different in different regions with different materials, with different roofs. Now all the new eco districts look the same, actually, whereas you are in the north of France or in the south of France. There's this kind of process also for building.
Exactly, we are suffering from Cecilia wants to talk. Okay, it's funny. Cecilia is speaking like you know, this deaf language, and she's asking Rodrigo. Rodrigo, pode colocar a Cecilia como co-host também? Eu acho que ela não está ainda. Deixa eu ver se eu consigo fazer isso. And so we have many questions, and I'm going to ask one from one of our students, which is Ana Picero, which is here with us. And she start with a question in the beginning, where there was showing a map of biodiversity, urban biodiversity. And she was asking how many times does it take to make this kind of maps about biodiversity, and what's the size of the team to make this survey of biodiversity.
You mean the indicators of biodiversity, or where we do the monitoring on the wetland? How long time for monitoring for biodiversity?
It was one of the first slides, wasn't it? I'm seeing, it wasn't. Era dos primeiros mapas, não? Que apresentou, que você fez a pergunta sobre o mapeamento, não foi? I think it's not hearing me because she's not like moving.
Yeah, but if it's about the indicators, it takes time actually, and we collect every year data on biodiversity from scientists, from researchers, and then every year we produce indicators of the state of biodiversity. And the graph I showed were produced on 10 years. On 10 years, you can have a trend for biodiversity status. But I don't know if it was if that was the question or another map.
I believe it was this one. Cecilia, no, I believe that you are unmuted, you can talk.
Yeah, now I can talk.
Yeah.
Thanks much for the great presentation. I was unable to thank you. And I think you talked about Ricardo Cardim, and I was with him in a round table right now. And
Nice.
And I just messaged him, and because he was talking exactly about how, because we are in a meeting about the biosphere reserve of Mata Atlântica, Atlantic Forest, and how the cities are built with no native species, nothing here. Everything is the same all over the country, and the problems that you just showed. And I messaged him to enter, but I think he didn't see it. Yeah, but thanks a lot for this presentation. I think people have a lot of questions, and I think FPA already have taken note about everything. I think it's better to go to what they say they are asking, and what are their issues and questions.
There is a question about native spaces and what kind of tools exist to promote and value native spaces. You show an example with this organization of producer of plants and nurseries, but is there any other action to promote and to value native spaces and its use?
Yeah, there's well, in France, in the different part of France, we have guidelines actually that are produced by local association of botanists. So, for example, I think if you ask a local association working on botany and local plants, they able to provide this kind of lists. And here in France, we asked the Museum of Natural History, and they just wrote a list of the local species that they advise for green space. So now these kind of guidelines are quite available, and in France, then we have for different types of green space, for forest, for urban green space, even for green roof, we can design some list of species. So that could be a tool, but I would say ask the experts in botany; they will know for sure. And then be careful, because there is this fashion now of native species and a little bit extremist, so we don't have any more place for other horticultural, and so I think the city is also a way. It's also interesting that we mix different kind of visions and different kind of species, and my colleague from the museum says that when it's horticultural species, it's also attractive for a lot of bees, and then that we have to keep it. So yeah, native species, but also keep a diversity of different stuff could be interesting.
Great. I also love your slides about bees and other insects, and that's nice. It's like a fashion of these insect hotels and houses, and it's really more important to have like natural habitats, alive natural habitats, than to really put them in. And I also like that there is like some scientific question. We don't do it like any way you can think you can do it. No? And we here in Brazil, ecological landscape is really, unfortunately, it's beginning, but it's really better than 10 years ago. That was like something completely new. Today we have a course, we have some park doing this kind of thing, but it's really like we have a dichotomy about nature, and nature is something far from city, and city and something like really artificial. What kind of tool, and you have presented a lot, but it's a question that have came back. Do you have to?
I can't hear you anymore. Yeah.
Sorry. My cat just just decided to cut me off. And what kind of instrument and you have to promote ecological landscape?
What kind of instrument you mean for?
Political ones.
Well, I don't know how the urban planning documents work in Brazil, but they're actually very good levers for that. But it's, well, in France, for example, you can do whatever you do with urban planning documents. You can either really well protect the land and nature, or even give guidelines. For example, in our urban planning, you can say, I want a 3-meter vegetation strip in front of the building, and then I want this color for the rooftop. There's a lot of guidelines actually, but all this is possible because of the political will. And then the same document could be very terrible for nature if it's another political vision. So it's I know it's stupid what I'm saying, but the best the best leverage is the political will at the moment. But there are also incentives. For example, one thing that is the most developed in cities today is a sustainable drainage system. For example, ponds, rain gardens, bioswales, floodable gardens, because there are incentives from the water agencies. So it's been rising for now some years, because there is these incentives that help people to create this kind of. So I think incentives could be very helpful. They even give money for green roof, for example. If they do a certain depth, above 8 centimeters of soil on green roof, we can have access to this incentive, then collect water, etc. So I would say, yeah, urban planning documents should be stronger, and then incentives can help also to have more nature.
Yeah, it's a critical point, because we have teaching of urbanism here is done in architecture school. People leave the faculty with a double diploma of architect and urbanist.
Mm-hmm.
And in my practice, in my day-to-day practice, I don't feel that it's people who are really touched with nature. It's people are sometimes are more touched with concrete, with stones, with iron or glass, and so it's a cultural movement we need to do about the place of nature. And we have the same words in Brazil about to clean an area.
Yeah.
We say limpar. It's the same thing.
Yeah.
We came and we clean everything. It's the same concept. So mortality concept, I believe. But it's so we need to touch urbanism, because really it's if as you say, if we have like a strip or natural strip. In Berlin, we have some environmental parameters for private lots, and we also with incentives, economic incentives on taxes.
Yeah.
So it's a point. We have another question from Eloise Antunes, which is asking, in France, is there any sample of an ecological corridor made by urban agriculture, or somewhere with agroforestry and meet ecology, some agroecological corridor? Do we have a sample of that kind of France?
Yes, there are some. There is one in the city of Paris, in the north part, which is called Recyclerie, the recycling spot. And it's actually an urban agriculture garden along the railway. So that makes a huge corridor, actually, because it's something like 200, 300 meters of urban agriculture, but also with orchards and different kind of plants and different kind of strata along what we call the Petite Ceinture in Paris. It's a former railway all around Paris. So that was made as a corridor. And then if you're talking about agroforestry project, they are more remote than they are not in the Paris center, they are more remote, but there are some nice projects of agroforestry now.
Yes, great. And here in Brazil, we have some agroforestry starting in the middle of the city, and by individual spontaneous action. That's if we have to look about square meter of implementation of green renatalization into city. Yeah. They are all made by collectives, by people. Someone, Monica in the chat, was asking that she's starting to break in our building with her neighborhood. Is starting to break all the concrete to make nature. Nice. And I believe in this moment that's the best. And it's a question which came back at every webinar. It's like, how do we change cities? And I believe that's today is most efficient is by your hand, and like
yeah, of course. When the people do it, then they show that it's possible, and yeah, sure.
So there is a question from Dalila Thiago, which is asking is there is any norma, it's norms in France will create critério, how do we say critério?
Criteria.
Criteria for evaluation and to give certification for cities that are really acting for nature and having like strong action for nature.
Yes, there are. At the city level, there is this competition I was talking at the beginning, which is called the French Capital of Biodiversity Award. So that's an annual competition for cities where they have to fill a questionnaire of 40 questions explaining what they do for biodiversity. And then we evaluate them by going on the field and scoring them. And they have an award. So that's this kind of a competition. They have a recognition of being engaged for biodiversity. And there's another initiative from the government in France, which is called Cities Engage with Nature, which is also a form of criteria of recognition of cities. And then the other label process are at the site scale. For example, the eco garden one that I was talking about, it's about a garden or green space, and then it's at the local level.
Perfect. Great. I believe competition is always a good thing, like to people make more. We have to think like conventional thinking to
Yeah.
I think it's inspirational. They want to do this, and then many countries have it. I think Korea has, the US also has some kind of green city ranking that they do have it. So I think it would be very interesting to have it here also in South America. I think in Colombia, they also have something regarding green infrastructure or biodiversity, because many cities are doing this for years now. So we are very late in Brazil, but we are doing, many Brazilian cities are also doing, but I think we must go much faster because climate change is here. The loss of biodiversity is huge. So I think the urbanites need to get in contact with nature in cities, with biodiversity in cities, not only manicured gardens, but with all the exotic species are everywhere, as you showed, you know. So I think it's very, very important to develop this biophilia. And what you showed is, actually, I visited some places. We did together some places in Paris and around Paris. And I had the chance to be in very, very interesting transformations in Sarcelles. And,
I remember you visited.
What's the name of the other city?
In Gonesse.
Gonesse. So it was, it's been done, but I think we have to go much faster. So I think maybe after this COP that just happened, and everybody's talking about nature-based solutions now, this may gain even the World Bank and all these institutions that are funding
I hope so.
projects. And we need this in the cities because we need the ecosystem services where people are, and we need people to get in contact with native ecosystems. So I think it's going to, it's kind of urgent. It's not, we cannot wait anymore. So yeah. And I admire a lot your work. So
our time is ending.
Yeah, I would like to thank you a lot, Mark, for having this time with us and being so inspiring and so many solutions, and not only solutions, but the methodologies also of doing things, planning and designing, and small scale and large scale. And you went to that. Thank you very much for your
Thank you. Well,
presentation.
my pleasure. My pleasure. And thank you for inviting me. And all the projects that I share, I can send you, of course, my presentation and some documents if you're interested in one particular project. Or we don't publish a lot in French, in English. I mean, like in France, everything is written in French. We're very bad at publishing in English, but I have some documents that I can share, or photos, of course.
Great. Well, I already bought some books that you were like the producer. And I hope I get to visit you soon. Let's see what's
I hope we'll see each other soon.
Yeah, yeah. And well, eu também quero agradecer muito a presença de todo mundo. Now you can hear the translation, Mark. A gente teve aqui quase 90 pessoas. Eu acho isso daí assim, sempre fantástico, porque com tanta concorrência, tantos eventos fantásticos acontecendo ao mesmo tempo, a gente ter vocês aqui é assim, sempre uma super alegria, né? O que motiva a gente a tocar em frente. Semana que vem, acho que o Pierre está colocando aqui, porque a gente está procurando o cartazinho do card da próxima palestra, que é do Jack Ahern, que vai ser na segunda-feira. A gente, semana que vem, tem 2 apresentações, uma na segunda e uma na quarta, porque o Jack pôde topar. Então, a gente vai ter o Jack Ahern, que foi um professor que me inspirou profundamente. Ele é um super papa, assim, ele foi orientador também do Paulo Pellegrini, que já esteve aqui com a gente, que fez o mestrado lá com ele. Então, eu recomendo que vocês não percam, porque ele é maravilhoso. E depois a Nina Marie Lister, lá de Toronto, na quarta-feira, ela é professora da universidade lá, da Paisagismo Ecológico também, e ela tem um ateliê super incrível, e é uma ativista também. Então, eu acho que a gente vai ter semana que vem 2 dias incríveis para encerrar essa série desse ano, tá? E, enfim, é isso. Queria agradecer muito a presença de todo mundo. Pierre, quer fechar? Mark, thanks a lot. Merci, Marc.
Merci beaucoup.
C'était un grand plaisir de t'avoir ici.
Merci de m'avoir invité. Avec grand plaisir. It's time for me to go to bed now. It's midnight.
Thanks for you are 4 hours ahead, right?
Yeah.
So thanks.
Eu vou falar um pouquinho em português. Je vais parler un petit peu en portugais, après on finit. Eu quero agradecer muito o trabalho dos intérpretes, né, do Tomás e da Carolina. Muito obrigado aí pela participação, assim, foi fantástico, muito bom sem vocês, enfim, isso não ia acontecer, então quero agradecer muito. Quero agradecer o Rodrigo, meu parceiro também, que está sempre presente, sempre animado, e a Amanda do CCS, também esse pessoal, nada disso aconteceria. Então, muito obrigado mais uma vez pela participação, pelo trabalho, pelo suor de vocês, que deixa esse trabalho tão bem organizado. Muito obrigado mesmo, né? E agradecer a cada um aí que está aqui, seguindo o seu grande Quarta Verde aí, né? Tem gente que já está quebrando concreto, né? Que não está aguentando mais ficar vendo uma notícia. Então, vamos lá, plantar, quebrar concreto, transformar as coisas, porque... eu acho que perante todas essas coisas que estão acontecendo, acho que nada melhor do que sentir que a gente, né, se sentir potente, nem que seja em 1 metro quadrado, mas sente que ali a gente consegue, a gente pode fazer alguma diferença. Então, muito obrigado a todos. And Mark, thanks a lot. I learned a lot, and you make a beautiful presentation with everything well organized. It was really a great presentation. I believe a lot of people learned a lot of things today, including me, and merci beaucoup aussi. Bonne nuit.
Merci. Obrigado.
Bonne nuit.
Bye bye.
Ciao.
Bye bye.